There are movies that get announced and they build up some crazy hype because they're a big brand or they're using popular characters, and they end up building some unrealistic expectations. And then they go on to not live up to that crazy hype or crazy expectations set by those fans. And those are the movies I'm going to be talking about, not necessarily bad movies. Well, some of them might be bad movies, but more movies that didn't live up to the hype because they weren't as good as people wanted them to be. So before I give you PTSD to what these movies could have been, make sure to like and subscribe because 99% of the people who watch my videos aren't subscribed, so don't be that 99%. So let's start off with the first one that had some crazy expectations and might have had the biggest hype of all time, at least in my lifetime, Batman versus Superman. Now, if you were around for the hype was crazy. Everyone was hyped for it. When you saw those Ben Affleck pictures, you saw the Batmobile, so much so that I had my elementary school teacher talking about these pictures when they came out. He would stop class to talk about Ben Affleck's new suit, Ben Affleck's new Batmobile. That's how hyped this movie was. And when this movie came out, I don't think I need to tell you how underwhelming this movie was. I think this movie is a solid movie and it gets bashed on because of, its crazy expectations and, the Martha scene is talked to death. And not to mention the weird Lex Luthor that is played by a good actor. He's really good in The Social Network, in The Art of Self-Defense, and so many other great movies. And he was just given a bad script in Batman vs. Superman. A great actor, just not the best writing. And I think that's kind of the main thing around this movie is that this movie has so many amazing scenes. The intro scene, I think it has to be one of the best intro scenes in all of comic book movie history, where you see Batman hopeless as he can only save one person as he sees two gods battling in the sky. An amazing scene. And then we get further along and we get to see Doomsday that looks like a Goomba. We get to see the Martha scene. We get to see the Justice League get introduced by emos. Like, why emos out of all things? Not to mention, the title is literally Batman versus Superman. This had the potential to be one of the biggest movies of all time, and obviously it did pretty well in the box office just because it was Batman versus Superman. But this movie realistically could have been the #1 grossing movie of all time if they did this well. You got Henry Cavill's Superman, you got Ben Affleck's Batman, you got so many other great actors in this one movie that it's kind of insane. Like when you think of fan casting, and you think about like people like to put these great actors into one conglomerate of a movie, this is the movie. There's so many great actors in here and they fumbled the bag. And obviously this movie has been talked to death about all its flaws, and I can only present you with a couple of them because this movie really did underperform. And I look at back at this movie and it has some amazing scenes, some amazing lines, and I think Zack Snyder is a really good director, but I just don't think he's a good director for this type of movie. And after this movie, I think Batman vs. Superman was kind of like the crack in DCU's armor, where like everyone was like, whoa, we're trying to recover from this movie. And that's when they started becoming more Avengers, MCU-like. And after this movie, this is kind of like the turning point to where they try to make DC a little more comedic in a sense. So this movie had so much potential to be so much better than it actually was, had potential to be one of the highest grossing movies of all time from just sheer hype alone, but it kind of fumbled it along the way. And I really wish this movie could have been way better than it actually is. Still a solid movie, but with the expectations it had, it just didn't live up to those expectations. Even though Batman vs. Superman was a solid movie, this next one won't be. Avatar: The Last Airbender, the movie specifically, because obviously there's a show coming out and it looks kind of decent and it looks solid, but I don't know if I'm really hopeful for it because all they can do is just make it as good as the animated series, and if you're just trying to be as good as the animated series, just watch the animated series. But the original live action movie Last Airbender, god awful. There's so many bad scenes, the cast calling him Ong, the earthbending scene, abysmal, been talked to death about. And I think one of the biggest things I have a problem with this movie is just how they bend. Like in the original animated series, when they bended elements, all their movements were perfectly choreographed. Every single movement had a purpose. But in the live action movie, they're just doing random moves to look cool, and the bending has no like alignment with their actual movements. The most obvious one is the ending scene when he goes into the avatar state and he's controlling this big old wave, which if you just look at this, he's like doing kicks, he's just doing like high kicks, he's doing punches, and it makes you question, why is he doing these kicks and punches just to move a wave? When he does in The Last Airbender, he simply just lifts up his arms because, he's lifting up a wave. He's not punching and doing these random punches to look cool. I think this movie looks solid. It looks pretty good. The CGI looks pretty good. I think M. Night Shyamalan was not true to the story at all. This story abysmal. There's so many things bad with this. I think they did Ira wrong. I think they did a lot of stuff wrong with this movie. that I can't even begin to explain. And we kind of all know how bad the last Airbender movie is. So many bad stuff. And M. Night Shyamalan, a solid director. He makes some interesting movies. And even though this live action was bad, it still had some crazy expectations because it was based off of the animated series that a lot of people love. It's an amazing show with amazing storytelling and amazing characters. And to see that in live action, a lot of people wanted to see it. So much so that it made $300 million by just being bad. Like, some good movies can't even reach $300 million, and this Last Airbender made that much. And it made a $300 million just off of the fact alone it's the Last Airbender live action movie. So that really shows you how much hype people have and actual fans there are for the Last Airbender. Now, time to get a little controversial because this is probably going to be the most controversial one on the list. Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. I honestly think there's still fans for this. Obviously, there's more fans for the prequels, but I feel like in my last video where I talked about movies that lived up to the hype, I mentioned Phantom Menace because Revenge of the Sith lived up to some crazy hype. Phantom Menace did the complete opposite. Now, I know this movie has its fans because this movie made $1 billion. This movie made a lot of money. So it just shows you how much people were excited to see this movie. And even though it was pretty bad, I don't think a lot of people can argue that. You just gotta think Jar Jar Binks, the whole pod racing storyline, whatever you want to call that, just a bunch of nonsense and bad writing up to that point. The whole one move dash where they can just like accelerate and dash and they never use that move again. Obviously, this movie has some great scenes. You know, you got Duel of the Fates theme song. The music is great. Some of the CGI still holds up to date. Darth Maul fights. Obi-Wan killing Darth Maul. I think Qui-Gon Jinn is a really good character in this, and I wish we would have seen more. But this movie just had so many flaws. It was really just like, it was just pretty much nostalgia for the original trilogy that people came back for the Phantom Menace, and it was very underwhelming. Even in back of the day, even though it made $1 billion, people still said it was very underwhelming for, you know, coming off of the back of one of the greatest trilogies of all time, the original Star Wars trilogy. Kind of a bit disappointing. Still so many great ideas in this movie, and the poster teaser for this movie has to be one of the best poster teasers of all time. But when it comes down to the movie, it didn't live up to those expectations, and I wish it did. Because it kind of had a really bad start off for the prequels, which get a lot of bad rep, and I know there's a lot of good stuff in there, but Phantom Menace really showed the flaws in the prequels. Next up, with probably the most recent one I have on the list, is The Flash. Now, The Flash movie, I would say, I don't know if it has as much hype as some of these other movies, but the rollout was pretty crazy for The Flash, if you really think about it. I think the hype for The Flash really started when we heard that it was going to be the Flashpoint movie, one of the greatest comic book stories of all time. The Flashpoint, everyone loves that story. It had a great animated movies. The comics were amazing. So people were hyped for the Flashpoint idea. And then we got the trailer. We got to see Supergirl. We got to see Michael Keaton's Batman back. We got to see a lot of these characters that we love back. There is so much hype built around this, and then, you know, Ezra Miller became like a psychopath, became, you know, an actual supervillain in real life, and, you know, it kind of delayed the movie, and it kind of put people off for this movie for a bit. And then people started talking about it when James Gunn said it has to be one of the best comic book movies he's ever seen. Now, when James Gunn says that, that's kind of crazy because he made the original Guardians and he made the Suicide Squad one of the best DC movies ever. And then he says The Flash is one of the best comic book movies ever after doing all of that. Once he said that, a lot of people were hyped and they were back on board. You know, they were able to excuse, I wouldn't really say excuse, they were willing to, you know, just like turn a blind eye to Ezra Miller being an actual supervillain for a bit to see this Flash movie and to see, is this one of the best comic movies ever made? And then we saw it, and this movie's okay, it's fine. I think it has some, I don't even think it has as good as scenes as Batman vs. Superman, but it's a fine movie. I don't know what James Gunn saw in it, but from the hype that this movie built up, from all the shenanigans going on with this movie was really hyped up. The CGI was kind of bad on some of those stuff. We had a bunch of cameos that really helped up the hype for The Flash when initially released. Nicolas Cage was in there. Michael Keaton, Batman is back and he's pretty solid. Sasha Cale's Supergirl was pretty cool. We got to see all the old Supermans come back, and they're all in weird CGI moments, and Ben Affleck has a pretty good scene in here. Wonder Woman shows up weirdly in this movie. A lot of weird stuff happened in this movie. But ultimately, this movie did not do as well as people thought it did. It's kind of like ignored nowadays. Not a lot of people talk about this movie anymore. Mainly the DCU doesn't even bring up this movie anymore at all. And not to mention, this movie cost like a gazillion dollars. It cost like $400 million or some crazy number to make. So realistically, they're never going to make this money back because this movie would have to have made $1 billion to make its money back, or even crazier heights to make its money back. And I'm sorry to tell you, the Flash is a really cool character, but with the bad press around this movie, with, you know, reviving dead actors and Ezra Miller being a supervillain, this movie was not going to do that amazing. which is kind of sad to see because I really like the Flash and a lot of other people like the Flash. So at our final number 5 slots, I kind of want to throw a couple of them out there. It's not going to be just one. I'm going to throw like about 4 of these out there because I don't have too much to talk about them individually, so I just wanted to throw some of them out there. Starting off, X-Men Origins. This movie was supposed to be pretty hyped. It was hyped up. Obviously, the first Wolverine movie. It was supposed to be start of like the whole X-Men Origins series, trilogy. I don't know what they wanted to do, but give some X-Men the origin stories. Obviously, this one flopped, and we never got those. And Deadpool's pretty bad at this too. Another one, Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull. Pretty bad. People were hyped to see Indiana Jones come to the big screen. His first 3 were amazing, one of the most perfect trilogies of all time. And Crystal Skull didn't live up to any of those expectations. Shia LaBeouf I would say he was held back by a pretty bad script because we've seen Shia LaBeouf be in some pretty good stuff, and this wasn't one of them. And for a movie directed by Steven Spielberg, not one of his best movies. And the whole Crystal Skull storyline, I don't think is like the best they could have done with Indiana Jones. And the whole jumping in the fridge is like a whole meme, and people have talked about that scene to death and have parodied it and all that type of stuff, and it's kind of become its own sort of term in a sense. And I would say the new Indiana Jones is like a much better continuation of Indiana Jones than this Crystal Skull was. Next up, A Wrinkle of Time. Remember that movie? Like, no one remembers that movie. That movie was hype because, it had Oprah in it. And I watched that movie, and I cannot tell you what happened in it. It feels like a fever dream. So much so that you probably don't even remember I talked about A Wrinkle of Time in here. And the final one, Spider-Man 3, kind of held back by, the whole producers and all that type of stuff, interfering with the script. I think Spider-Man 3 has some pretty good scenes. I would say it's a pretty fun movie. A lot of these scenes are very comedic, but it came off of one of the best movies and one of the best comic movies of all time, Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man 2 are held on super high regard. No one talks about Spider-Man 3 as being one of the best superhero movies ever, but they do like some of the scenes. But we all know it could have been way better if, the studio didn't want them to add Venom and Sandman and Hobgoblin and all of these other villains that they didn't have. I think Sandman was good enough for this villain. I think Sandman was amazing. Like that one scene where he holds the necklace was amazing, and then we got the whole weird Venom character in this movie that kind of ruined it. And obviously Sam Raimi has talked about how including Venom pretty much ruined this movie for him. But obviously this is just my opinion. Obviously people are not going to like my list because some of these movies are really popular and they obviously have their fans. Spider-Man 3 included. I like Spider-Man 3. I think some of those scenes are funny, and there's a lot of Zack Snyder fans, so I know people will be upset with that. And obviously Star Wars has a huge fan base, but I think everyone knows Phantom Menace is not that great. And also let me know down in the comments some movies that you think should have been on here, some movies that you think had so much hype but didn't live quite up to them, because there's so many movies I could have put on this list that it simply didn't. So I would love to know your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, subscribe, join the Discord, and I hope to see you guys next time. Later, hater. Peace. If I